Welcome back, warriors, where war never ends, insanity never lasts. Don't forget to hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and brace yourselves. Because from here on out, there is only war. Let's go. You knew this was coming. I kept teasing it, and if nothing else, if I was ferociously fanboying over Halo for the Covenant and Forerunners, I couldn't have just ignored the faction that is pretty much responsible for everything we see in the Halo universe. I mean, come on, without them we'd have no anything. There would still be foreign or domination of the galaxy, and mankind would actually, I don't know, part of the reason for the Foreigner-Human War was because humanity was simultaneously retreating from and eliminating these parasites. Who knows what would have happened had they not intervened. There's something you should know though. While I will of course talk about what you're likely familiar with in this miniseries, and without spoiling it too early, I'll actually give the factions from 40k some credit for once. The creatures you know from the original Halo trilogy were once far different from their modern iterations. What became a cruel and corruptive, zombie-like hive mind was once the most dominant race in the Halo universe. And yes, I mean universe. So in a way this is a bit of a two-for-one video. The first portions will largely be lore and the precursors, because in order to understand the main subject of the video I feel obligated to do my best to explain what we know about him, and of course the more I'm talking about Halo, the happier I am. I'll try not to focus on them too much when they were the precursors, and I'll chapter the video, so if you just want to skip to the 40k bits, feel free. But to finally stop beating around the bush on this matter, allow me to tell you how the flood of Halo could devour the 40k galaxy. But first, a word not from a sponsor. Ha, I got you, didn't I? No sponsor of this one, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you all. Nearly 100k, and a New Year's coming up, so I hope everyone else has a good New Year, and I hope this channel does as well. Insurance issues that all haunt me for the rest of my life aside, this has pretty much become my full-time job, and I couldn't do without all of you. How fitting the deck be talking about insurance, but seriously, thank you all for the support. Now then, I hope you're wearing a Class 12 combat skin, because otherwise you're in for a rough time, and to all yours. Unlike 4K's own devouring hive mind race, the Flood were not always, well, what I just described. They were once erased, known as the Precursors. I'm tempted to des them as the Forerunners on steroids, but that doesn't come close to what they were, because what they really were H.P. Lovecraft gods. To say they ruled the universe is a funny way of putting it, because they had interesting outlooks on reality. But if they wished to, I have no doubt they could have before I get into their tech and all that stuff. You're no doubt terribly interested in, so you could explain how Zacharias could on-shot them. I want to talk about them for a bit. They seeded life in the galaxy billions of years ago, so already we're on a timescale well past 40k zone. They could accelerate the evolution of life as fast as, or as slow as, they wished it to be, and the reverse was true as well. They would oftentimes spend their lives as devolved, humble farming races, for the form they took was of no consequence to them. One day they might decide to be Cthulhu, the next day they're Gilgamesh, and then 100,000 years later they're Farmer Brown, counting as space chickens for the yearly harvest. Don't think about that sentence too much. I grew up in the suburbs, alright? They believed that the universe itself was alive in a way, only in a way and scale far different from you and me. They believed that the consciousness of living beings served to enrich the universe as a whole, a concept in Halo known as neural physics. If this is suddenly like some real hippie to you, then you're probably right. But if the hippies are able to throw galaxies at you like ping pong balls, maybe they're onto something. But before that, a bit of how they viewed life. They weren't good or evil, strictly speaking, but they considered suffering, strife, and indeed evil as necessary parts of life. They believed it added to its sweetness, which is the only word I can give you, because whatever word they would have used didn't really cross the language barrier so goodly. Now for their tech abilities and all that good stuff. Part of what helped them be able to live so many different lives is that they could reincarnate and live a new death. After all, death is just another part of life. So of course they wish to experience it every now and then. And in a rare moment of me actually dissing the Eldar, the Precursors managed to do this for billions of years without murder got into existence. Good job, Precursors. They also weren't a hive mind, by the way. Not yet anyways. So this was straight up reincarnation, not having your brain waves vored back into a collective consciousness. They could do pretty much everything the Foreigners could do, you know, crossing into different universes, throw planets at people to piss them off, the usual, except with the Precursors, it wouldn't be a planet, it would be a galaxy. Now that's a good way to tell someone to off. I'm not making that up, by the way. The Foreigner known as the D had a freak out when he learned what they could do, throw galaxies around, just moving them around like Minecraft blocks and creating life from nothing. Their FTL methods were described as leaving lingering multiversal residue when they entered real space again. I have no idea what the hell that means, but I'm going to assume that means they just walk through other realities to reach their destination like a goddamn nether portal system. And there's my favorite invention of theirs as well. Star roads. Now that sounds kind of boring, I admit. What they were roads between planets and potentially even different star systems, miles and miles thick and immune to all forms of attack. Let the scale of that sink in a bit. A road between a star system, Not like a Stellaris hypertravel lane, a physical thing. These things stretch between planets. That's something billions of miles long, and these things were everywhere. They could also change their mass at will, not as in they could shed bits of themselves as required, so they were lighter or heavier. One section of the road might be 100 plons ions 1 minute, the next is 10,000, and then after that it's 10. Nothing about thought the road was changed. There was no rearrangement. Reality has been rewritten. So this thing is now a different mass that shows a complete mastery of the universe like no other, because it's just rewriting reality on a whim. And while the Precursors didn't really use them for violence, the Flood used them to strangle planets. They did that with the first ark the Foreigners built, which was itself bigger than the one in Halo 3, which was in turn itself several dozen times the size of a planet. Imagine being some foreigner just chilling out on a planet, living life. Then the galactic Autobahn comes screaming out of space and strangles your planet into a black hole, before smacking your fleet out of orbit, like a game of Whack-A in the domain. I discussed in the Foreigner video was their creation. They wanted to store all they had gathered about the universe, and one giant sentient supercomputer that used the very Milky Way galaxy to run itself. Aside from doubtlessly being able to run Doom, it was also able to shut out those it didn't like. This is why the Foreigners, despite being able to access whatever they put into it, noticed massive blank spots of information they couldn't access. The domain itself was telling them to go to hell. They just didn't realize it. Now if they were so powerful, how did they disappear like all ancient precursor civilizations do? Well, the Foreigners wiped them out. So how did they do that? Great question. There are several answers presented, and none of them come from a completely reliable source. What I can tell you isn't true is what the Foreigners largely believed. They thought the Precursors peacefully faded away and left them in charge. That theory is historical revisionism to the highest. That Foreigner commanders spread after they murdered all the Precursors to make Foreigners feel good about themselves. After this one though, the theories get screwy. A Precursor survivor, and I use that term very loosely, says that the Foreigners attacked them unprovoked. I am if every single insect in your backyard suddenly marched into your room and started devouring you. That's essentially what this kind of Precursor said had happened. Doesn't matter how strong you are if you're 10% blindsided. Meanwhile, Foreigner accounts by those who actually know a bit about what happened say that instead of passing the role of guardians of all life on to the Forerunners, they were going to give it to humanity instead, and genocide the Forerunners out of existence. In this version of the story, the Foreigners just got the jump on them before they could do it. So using that insect analogy again, imagine it's largely the same. Only the bugs got wind that you were going to call an exterminator in a few days. There's also the possibility that many Precursors simply let the Foreigners kill them because of that whole life is both joy and suffering thing they had going. Whatever the case, the specifics are both incredibly violent and lost to time, as shown by when the DC found out just what they could do, and he freaked out and wondered how the hell the Foreigners ever beat them. Of course, this was still a race of Lovecrafting, and beings that only technically aren't gods. Kind of hard to kill them, and indeed at least a few of them retreated out of the Milky Way in some form or another. One of the forms many of them took was as a powder that would eventually coalesce back into Precursors proper. But be it the ravages of time or sabotage, something happened to this powder, and it was corrupted. Instead of reforming the Precursors, it created a new form of life that was hell-bent on revenge, one that would assimilate all into itself so that never again could its creations rise up against it. This powder, as you've no doubt guessed, became the Flood. The Warhammer Center was coming soon, I promise, but to explain the Flood, imagine the Tyranids. Okay, now, instead of them just eating you, they shove a toddler-sized ball of popcorn in your chest, and you become one of them. Everything you know of value is then assimilated into the hive mind of the Flood. Everything useless to them is discarded, not shoved to the back of your mind, not moved around in your neurons, gone. Deleted Era 44. Fond childhood memories of your mother not found. The novelization of Combat Evolve shows Captain Key going through this as he desperately dresses up memories from his past that the Flood has to go through before it can find the location of Earth, as well as him constantly repeating his military identification number over and over, so he always has something to use as a shield to almost keep sane. As they grow in number, they begin harvesting corpses to form a grave mine, the true guiding intelligence of the Flood, an intelligence far beyond any AI. If there is anything remotely biological, the Flood can consume it. While there are beings in Halo that cannot be infected by the Flood due to lacking a central nervous system, most prominently the Hunters, their biomass can still be absorbed and used by it. All of your secrets are learned, all of your tactics, your battle plans that you're aware of, how your logistical networks run, everything to get back to Halo. When this powder came back, ancient humanity decided to give it to their pets to make them more attractive and fertile. I wish I was kidding. I mean, is that not the first thing you think of too? Oh wow, look at this cool mushroom I found in the forest. Hey Pitchtoe, come lick it for me. I think it'll give me some real cute puppies. Halo L gets weird, man. Then their puppies started getting a little silly, just a little bit wacky. Then space zombies happened in ancient humanity and their allies, the ancient prophets, just going to skip past that without explaining it. No time waged war on the Flood when it spread to foreigner planets. They started getting rid of those planets for some reason. They didn't explain that there was a zombie apocalypse going on in ancient foreigner society, so they thought humanity was just randomly invading them for shits and giggles. Humanity fights a two-front war and loses. The Flood pretend to be driven off, so the foreigners think they're secure to the Flood, and then they hardcore prank the foreigners by revealing that, no, there's not a thing like that, before reactivating all of their dormant tech to wipe the foreigners out. And it nearly worked. As the foreigners were losing ground, the Flood's absorption capabilities meant that they learned more and more about foreigner tech, as well as how to use and counter it. Every killed foreigner was another Flood to worry about. Classic zombie stuff, and eventually the Flood hit critical mass and formed a key mind. If a grave is smart, a key mind makes ZTH look like Gork and more. It is the ultimate intelligence, capable of guiding the Flood across the galaxy simultaneously and infecting spacetime itself. Yeah, the Flood have their own form of chaos corruption if you let them get out of control. As they devoured huge swaths of the galaxy, the foreigners also learned the hard way that the Flood could control the tech they had as precursors, and that's when foreigner planets started getting strangled by those fancy star roads. Even their AIS became infected. Remember what I said about them being smart. The key mind is so intelligent that they just corrupt machines despite being purely biological. The main foreigner AI in charge of the military, Medicant Bias, was turned to their side after being locked in the science fiction hyperbolic time chamber with a grave mind for a few years. So don't think you're safe just because you've replaced your lungs with a forge below tech priests. As for how the Flood were defeated, it was because the Halo area was almost accidentally designed to utilize neurophysics for its firing sequence, which turned all those fancy breakers or weapons into soup, and also killed everything left alive in the galaxy by that point, which meant the Flood was starved out, much like the Tiade would have been in this situation. Unrelated, but there was a bit in the foreigner novels where right as the rings are being activated, the isodidac hears the signals of a race that was just beginning to reach the stars, which is both incredibly depressing and incredibly funny. Imagine you move into a new neighborhood and the day after you finish setting everything up, you walk outside to go say hi to your new neighbors and immediately get hit with the spirit bomb. Alright, I feel like there's more I can say, but I'm over 8 pages of script into the video, and I haven't started the actual Warhammer crossover bit. Didn't plan on this video just being half Halo lore, but here we are. So how would the Flood FA in the 40k galaxy? I won't be doing the Precursors themselves as they were, because to be frank, I think it'd just be a guaranteed win for them. They'd leave the galaxy and toss another one at it if they failed. They'd do it again and again and again, or just create a race with the sole purpose of influencing the warp and creating their own chaos, god if not an outright, to sending themselves to become a new race of the old ones, more so than they already were. Anyways, now if you look at the title of this video, which I assume you did, you probably noticed the big glaring could in the title, because unlike the Covenant and Forerunners, I don't think the Flood is guaranteed to either hold their ground or sweep the galaxy. They could do either. But to show you what I mean, let's start with scenario 1. The Flood gets wiped from the galaxy pretty quickly. Let's start the scenario off on an Imperial world. Doesn't matter much which it is. Don't worry about how it got there. It's not important. It's shut off a Flood ship on their way across the multiverse to go stomp some foreigner or something. Don't think about it. What's important is what it's going to do, namely infect some poor schmuck on his way to work. Or something like that. Could be a hive world, could be an aggro world, doesn't matter. Rapidly, the Flood begins to infect others as it does. It can spread through spores in the atmosphere as well as the popcorn balls. It's just that, either for technical or balancing reasons, it never does this in the Halo games. If only so the Arbiter doesn't get turned into a zombie when he shows up to give you a lift out of high charity in Halo 3. But that does mean that even if you don't get caught by infection forms, you're still joining their ranks when the air turns to cancer. Now, taking into account both the Flood's capabilities and my intense favoritism of Halo, I'm going to say the scenario is in the middle of the three, in terms of which is most likely to happen. It also relies heavily on one thing: competent Imperial officials. As the Flood infects more and more people, someone important realizes that it's about to hit the fan hard if this problem isn't taken care of quickly. Let's say there's an Inquisitor like Emberla Vale or Krypin in the system while the outbreak is happening. The Flood are many things, and they can be subtle on a grand level. After all, the foreigners didn't really know about the Flood's true capabilities at first and weren't really aware of it at all when the humans and prophets were trying to take care of it. That being said, on the local level, it is anything but subtle. You can't hide a Flood infection. I mean, look at this thing. This doesn't exactly fit in with the Imperium's ideal of the whole holy human form. Now does it? Unless I missed something in the 9th edition core rules that says Taco Bell diarrhea is now considered sacred. As the parasite spreads across the planet, so important manages to order what needs to be done: exterminatus of the planet. Doesn't really matter what kind of bomb you use. Either way, the end result is that the planet is bathed in fire, and the Flood perish alongside everyone on the planet with it. An anticlimactic end to the galaxy's greatest threat. I say this could happen because, unlike the Covenant and Forerunners, who are not only advanced but also established powers, the Flood in this case start off with basically nothing. The potential to create and tap into their high mind intelligence exists in every single flood spore, and indeed despite them being almost completely eliminated in the Forerunner Flood War, the Gravemen in Halo seems to have perfect memories of it. So clearly there's something psychic going on with their intelligence. But nevertheless, they have to go through a fairly lengthy process to actually reach it, starting off with nothing but a single spore. It's entirely possible that the Imperium could deal with it before it reaches critical mass. Additionally, the UNC and Covenant are capable of preventing it from reaching truly galactic proportions. It has been able to wrong foot all factions in Halo before, but if a shotgun can keep a combat form down, then a bolter certainly can as well. This scenario is also more or less likely depending on which world the flood starts on. Of course, worlds like Hive worlds, while having a much higher amount of people to infect on it, also have a higher chance of attracting the attention of someone with a planet killer. When half of a hive suddenly looks like the worst kind of person in a convention, smells like you're going to notice. Same goes for if they end up on a tower world. I don't think the greater good is likely to include the flood in it. Trying to infect the craft or ELAR initially would lead to them being sensed out and Darth Sias to death. Most likely, they would probably have a field day with the orcs. To be totally honest with you, while the average boy could certainly take on a combat form, it's the matter of them getting infected. And truth be told, in my opinion, I think the flood spores are going to be able to outfight the orc spores, or however you want to word that. If I have to explain to you why the flood wouldn't get anywhere with a 2 moral, then please kindly direct your attention to the nearest wall and headbutt it until the neurons in your brain realign themselves. And as for them spawning in a Tyranid-infested planet, honestly, it could go either way. The flood could doubtlessly absorb slain Tyranid bioforms. I mean, when they're dead, they're just meat. Hell, infecting dead corpses is a valid way of gaining soldiers and biomass SL intelligence for a grave mine as far as the flood care. But as for living Tyranids, I'll leave that up to whatever you want to think. Maybe the flood can infect them like any other. Maybe the Tyranids can't be infected. Maybe they can, but the Tyranids might be able to combat it or adapt to it. Up to you, and your answer to this question determines how likely the flood can spread in the scenario. And there's always a couple of ways other factions could hinder the flood at this stage as well. The flood can't affect demons any more than the Tyranids can eat them. So if this first flood spore SPS on a planet that's having a chaotic problem, it probably won't end well for the flood. And if the flood are really unlucky, the Necron might catch wind of the flood spreading out an Imperial world and use that fancy Star Destroyer button they have. System goes supernova before the flood spreads. Necrons are laughing the whole time. Did you know it's more like a galactic yard schmurr than a weapon and knee stuff entirely unrelated? But I felt like throwing it in there for you. Now for scenario 2. The flood are able to become another faction in Warhammer, not stopping but not advancing much like everyone else in the setting. Now this one will go ahead and say is the least likely in my opinion, but for the fun of it, I'll talk about the situation much the same as the first. But there's no intelligent and/or trigger-happy Inquisitor around to blow the flood-infested planet to Kingdom Come. The flood takes over the world and begins spreading across the local sector. Fleets are dispatched to halt the spread and eliminate the threat, but the Imperium underestimates the capabilities of the flood. Each regiment set to combat them just ends up joining their ranks, and as the flood grows more in numbers, its intelligence rises in equal measure. Tactics of those sent to face it are memorized and dealt with as they come up anew. Eventually a slew of planets are firmly under flood control, infested to beyond repair, and never to be reclaimed. However, in the scenario, the flood comes to a halt after an initial surge of growth. Once the Imperium and other races of the galaxy become accustomed to the threat, they learn a few key things. 1. For the love of God, eliminate any shits with flood on them that are inbound. 2. Security is going to need to be tighted into hell and back, and you better get used to shooting shits coming out of flood contested systems on site. But it can theoretically be done too if they land on a world. Devote every bit of resources you have to eliminating them, assuming you can't just blow it up. There is no threat higher than a flood infestation on a planet, and if they show up, you need to eliminate that entire area. Even in Halo 3, when the UNC was down to pretty much just Earth, they were willing to let half of Africa get glass because the flood was just that much of a risk. 3. If the planet looks like it's going to be a goner, just nuke the entire thing. While it'd be incredibly difficult to manage, it's entirely possible that the flood would become just another faction in the 40k setting if proper containment is followed. Containment in the traditional sense, of course, not containment in the destroy the entire galaxy with giant hula hoop sense. Funnily enough, this is one of those threats that might cause some of the factions to show some unity with each other, much like the Tyranids. I see no reason the Imperium wouldn't work together against the flood. Same with the Eldar. Hell, if it was bad enough, maybe it would be like the War of the Beast, where Iron Warriors and Imperial fists fought alongside one another. That'd be wild. Now I say this is the least likely situation to happen because the flood, in my mind, aren't really a threat you can stall like this. You can either get rid of them, or you're getting turned into fungal stew. Since they're not only going to gain numbers and intelligence, but knowledge of whatever they're infecting this through by how they could drive vehicles of the Covenant in the UNSC, see no problem as well as hijack foreigner ships, you'll have a major problem where, once they hit critical mass, there's no stopping them. For some reason, Google Docs auto-corrected critical mass to critical ass, which isn't important at all, but it made me chuckle, so I thought I'd let you all know that happened. Anyways, this critical mass problem is the same as in any zombie-related media. Granted, most zombies can't clear buildings in a single jump and outmath Isaac Newton, but it's the same problem. After a certain point, the apocalypse is coming by sheer weight of numbers. As for their intelligence, absorbing 1 million guardsmen might not tell them anything important. They might gain some colorful new words to call the regimental commissar. But that's it. But they still gain the intelligence of all those guardsmen added on top of one another for the grave mind. Additionally, absorb the right tech priest, and they know all about how the weapons they're facing and absorbing work. Absorb the right officer, and you've got knowledge of the Imperial tactical and strategic plans for the area at that man's time of death. And do I really need to tell you why a flood-infected and enhanced space marine would be bad news for anyone in a light year radius? Though for all my talk of this being the most unlikely scenario, this is the one that would be the coolest with the Flood as an army in 40k. Since they certainly got the potential to be a kick-ass army, Flood puriforms would be fantastic models. Imagine something on the tabletop like the Flood carrier form. You send 1 or 2 of them into a unit of guardsmen, and if all goes well, you can infect them to your side. Imagine how cool of an army that would be, one that might start off weak and absorb the enemy into their side to turn the tide. Imagine the arrogant face of someone who brings a tide into the game board. Now imagine that smug grin being wiped off as a swarm of popcorn models clamor over the thing, infect everyone in it, and turn it against them. That would be cool. I don't care if it's unbalanced, it'd be awesome, wouldn't it? Now scenario 3, the one that is both the situation I think is most likely, and the one that is going to once more rear accusations of me being a biased Halo fan. To address that second one first, yes. Now let the jerking off of Halo commence. This is not your grave, but you are welcomed in it. The Flood begins on a planet and completely devastates it. Unlike scenario 1, the Imperium or Tau or whoever is in charge cannot eradicate the threat, and it begins rapidly spreading across the sector. Aside from them gaining strength in numbers as they grow, the main issue is their assimilation. Everything they assimilate not only gives them that creature's abilities and knowledge, but enhances their strength and agility as well. It's how a standard, uninfected Marine can slap the Master Chief across the map despite him being a goddamn demigod of war. Additionally, them being perfectly able to use the tech of a race they assimilate means that if you don't eliminate the Flood with an army you send after them, they're going to know how to deal with you after the fact. The Flood hive mind begins as a proto-grave mind, a largely defenseless blob creature. That being said, once one of these things are formed, the Flood vastly increase in intelligence, and it will undoubtedly make itself impossible to reach, or at least as close to impossible as it can, therefore ensuring the Flood's intellectual capabilities rise alongside their physical ones. As for how a single Flood spore can grow to take over a whole species, it's the same way as every zombie thing ever. Their exponential growth. 1 bag gets 2 bag, gets 4 bag, gets a whole lot more. I think the Imperium's massive scale would screw them over in this case, in both the large scale and the small scale. In the small scale, I mean that literally. In the case of all the big things they build, imagine a single Flood spore getting to a night with just a single infection form or airborne spore. The Flood have a death machine now, grow that up to a Titan Legion. Much like Nurgle and the Tyranids to some extent, they create a biosphere to spread themselves with. It even looks like a Nurgle-like chaos infection. Funnily enough, sick, gross, and nasty-ass looking. So any guardsmen deployed to a Flood-infested world might just find themselves feeding the Great Mine. The Flood also have their own pure forms that are more than capable of holding their own in a fight. You've got Stalkers, the ranged things they turn into that shoot needles at you, the Flood tank, and of course the Flood Juggernaut. It was cut from Halo 2 and that's probably for the best because beating that thing on Legendary would make me cry. The Boulevard of Jackal Snipers is already bad enough, but in terms of Warhammer, this thing is more of a damn dreadnought. It's the size of one, and it hits like one. On top of all the other crap they got from Halo Wars 2. I mean, look at these things. Just to go a bit more into their infectious capabilities I mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that Foreigner AIs are fully sentient artificial people, at least in terms of how advanced they are. If the Flood can infect those, I see no reason the Flood would have any issues infecting machine spirits once it devotes effort to it. They might not even need to infect the pilot of a Knight or Titan, for instance, just its machine spirit. And if nothing else, part of the reason Mendicant Bias was corrupted by the Flood is because the key mind convinced him to turn against the Forerunners. Some machine spirits are pretty damn close to just being AI if they aren't already, and the Flood is so goddamn charismatic that it can convince them to betray the Imperium. This charisma is naturally being helped by a healthy dose of corruption. And if you're thinking that something like this might take a while, remember the Flood are capable of infecting spacetime itself. Even if it were to be the case that the key mind has to individually talk to every single Titan spirit for years on end, that's not as much of a problem when the year-long conversation takes place over the course of about 5 minutes. And depending on how prevalent machine spirits truly are, the Imperium is even more vulnerable. A lot of what the Imperium calls machine spirits are actually just something like programs and stuff, like a computer nowadays, so that's not that big of an issue. The Flood can probably infect it with the oldie computer virus and make it not work, but that's just a single piece of equipment not working. No big deal. But if the other end of that scale is true, and AI is truly a part of almost every major piece of Imperial equipment, the Flood may very well kickstart a second Men of Iron rebellion. And as far as things like walkers go, they can just infect those the old-fashioned way, with popcorn ball to the spinal column. That's a computer and person infected all at once. Just eat the guy plugged into the battleship's navigation system, and you've not only got yourself a pilot, but you know how to pilot every other ship of its type. As the Flood infest more and more of space, they only become more and more powerful. There's no spreading themselves out too thin here. Much like the Tyranids, the Flood hive mind can be directing an entire battlefield all at once. However, it's much harder to disrupt the Keymind's presence amongst the Flood. There's far less in the way of synapse creatures amongst the Flood, so you can't just shoot the big one and have the Flood all turn into mindless beasts. At best, you can destroy the Grave Mind overseeing the Flood, but there's a couple of problems with that. Problem 1. The Grave Mind doesn't even need to be on the same planet to direct the Flood, and a Keymine undoubtedly has an even larger range as well. Problem 2. The Grave Mind is, at a minimum, the size of a damn Titan. Some things I've read say its body might be hundreds of kilometers large, and if that's the case, nothing short of an orbital bombardment is killing that thing. Either way, you're going to need some big guns to kill it. Problem 3. It's not just a giant blob. A proto-Grave Mind is, but a Grave Mind proper isn't. In this scenario, the Flood are long past the stage of proto-Grave Mind. A Grave Mind, meanwhile, can launch things across space if it needs to. As in, pick up a Flood combat form, stuff it in a fleshy drop pod, and just catapult that across the solar system. It does it in Halo 3 pretty frequently in the last level. Aside from that, meaning that it can theoretically spread infections across the system it's in, without even needing to send any proper Flood combat forms there. There's the much more direct issue of, if it can do that, anything that tries to fight it is going to be turned into a Dark Souls bloodstain real goddamn quickly. Good luck fat rolling around this thing. As for the larger scale working against the Imperium, the Flood absorb their enemies as they do. The problem this poses for the Imperium is that there's a whole lot of people to infect. And as I keep saying, that everyone infected is another Imperium material that's now working against it. It's kind of like how in the World War Z book, China kept throwing men at zombies, not knowing that every time they lost a man, they gained a zombie to fight. Or rather, not really caring, which I doubt the Imperium would either, given that it's, the Imperium. Hell, if the Flood begins somewhere in the Ghoul Stars or another region of space uncharted to the Imperium, and grows to critical mass, suddenly entire swaths of Imperial space are under attack by the parasite. Additionally, the Flood are more than capable of figuring out how to repurpose equipment to suit itself. In the case of 40k, there are a lot of hive worlds, forge worlds, and more that can be taken over to produce armaments and ships for the Flood. Once the know-how of doing this is figured out by the hive mind, it's endless supplies of stuffs for the Flood to produce to help their war effort. War effort, never-ending buffet, same difference, Something I think is pretty neat is that I think it's likely the Flood will produce the exact same issue as a Tyranid Hive fleet invasion. The shadow of the warp. It is, after all, a massively complex and overreaching intelligence stretching across time and space. Who's to say that the Flood can't do the same thing as the Nids in this case? Albeit, against the Flood, the Psychers go insane because some won't stop speaking an iambic pentameter at them every time they try to use magic. No matter what the Imperium throws at the Flood in this scenario, it can't be stopped. World after world falls to it until they have devoured the majority of the Imperium, and mankind's fate is sealed, along with the rest of the galaxy. The ever-present orcs will only present more food and soldiers for the Flood. The schemes of the Eldar are no match for the intelligence of the Keymine. Clearly, the two will survive and repopulate the galaxy. And I can't even finish this joke. They get stopped straightforward. Space and time itself begin to corrupt itself into a living hell, potentially preventing demons from manifesting in real space. The same issue will also plague the Tyranids. If space and time are absolutely Smeckledorf, then the Tyranids' travel across the galaxy can be splintered and disrupted enough to make them easy pickings. Regardless, as industrial centers fall and armies are infected, the Flood will have more than enough manpower to handle Tyranid Hive fleets. Kamara and the Black Library likely won't even be safe, as the moment a webway gate is found. It's time to go ballistic with the Flood spores. Even the forces of chaos will be forced to bow to the unending tide of the parasite pouring across the galaxy, with cultists and marines being infected in turn, while demons are gunned down by their former servants. As for the end game, the Flood will begin to finish with the rest of the holdouts amongst the galaxy. Depending on how powerful the Flood's absorption really is, there's a very real chance they might develop psychopowers, in which case the Precursors, as they were, are back, now just a lot grosser. You may say that being the god that he is, the Emperor could handle the Flood. And individually, of course, that's true. There's no Flood form that'll manage to harm him. But as a god, he is weakened as his worshippers die off. And as the Flood consumes more and more, not only will he lose worshippers, which deprives him of power, which to note is the same issue the Chaos Gods will face, he will also receive less and less psychers to empower him. The daily dose of psychers he needs to sustain himself will dwindle from the thousands to the hundreds to the dozens, to finally none. The end of the Imperium in this scenario may not come from a flood invasion of terror, but a warp storm as he finally dies, and chaos overtakes the cradle of man. As for the Necrons, you might think they'll be the inheritors of the galaxy, as robotic beings should be relatively safe. But this won't be so. The average Necron warrior could potentially eventually be infected by the Flood's logic plagues. They aim to infect the machinery of other races. Even disregarding that, the Flood are not just predators like the Tyranids. They're hateful. They want an unending hell of subjugation for all life. And the Necrons, while not technically alive anymore, are not likely to be spared the wrath of the insane remnants of the Precursors. As the Flood takes over the industrial centers of other realms, it will turn them towards the Necrons to eliminate them. It will learn the secrets of the Necrons' ultimate weapons, and turn them against not only them but the Citan, some of the only beings capable of threatening them. That in their shattered state will be easy pickings for a mass flood invasion. As the last of the mortal beings in the galaxy are consumed on multiple levels, it becomes an unrecognizable hell. Not only are infected planets turned into flood worlds, covered in their biomass, but space and time itself warped beyond recognition. The library in the Forerunner trilogy mentions that looking at the stars, they looked off somehow. Whatever the Flood were doing, pumping as they were wiping out the Forerunners, they were causing the galaxy to become wrong on a fundamental level. However they managed to do it, the end result is the galaxy becoming something closer to hell than anything we would know. Physics are entirely rewritten, much like how their star roads could rewrite reality to change their mass, and life may very well become impossible. Any chaotic incursions attempting to combat the Flood are dealt with easily, either by the unending tide of combat forms banishing them back to the warp, or because once in real space, demons need to at least somewhat follow the laws of physics. The Flood can simply rewrite these laws to be to their advantage. The Eye of Terror will more than likely end up closed, as will the Great Rift, whether that be due to the Flood being able to build something similar to the Necron pylons, or the sheer psychic weight of the Flood hive mind shutting it down. Like the Tyranid's shadow in the warp, either way, the end result is the same. As the last of their followers and mortal beings they draw sustenance from are infected, the Chaos Gods begin to wither and fade. The 40K galaxy is subsumed into the Flood. It may have taken another 20,000 years from the days of the Human Covenant War, and 140,000 years from when they nearly consumed the galaxy the first time around, but their victory is inevitable. We exist together now, two corpses in one grave, and that's it. You've survived yet another video of mine. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think, or just rant about some filthy Xenos, that works too. Well, that wraps up the Halo x Warhammer series. I hope you all enjoyed this insane crossover as much as I did writing it. And yeah, I know some of you are foaming at the mouth, ready to tell me how Flood would totally lose to Tyranids, or Necrons would delete them instantly. That's the point. The Flood is terrifying in some ways, but in 40K, nothing is ever that simple. Don't worry though, I'm not done with Halo just yet. There's a whole bunch of lore to cover, and if this series has proven anything, it's that people love Halo content just as much as they love making fun of me for it. But for now, time to get back to what you expect from a Warhammer channel. You know, actual Warhammer content. And of course, shout out to my channel members. You guys are the random people to my Flood infection forum. Okay, that sounded way worse than I intended. But hey, use your imagination. Thanks for watching. Take care out there. Alright, now hear me out. Gravemind, big scary monster, manipulative, wants to consume all life. I bet he gives the sloppiest toppy in the universe. Debate me in the comments.